for one of these events. This semester we've been talking about Jason Mott's Hell of a Book, which is a novel about the Black experience in America. It's a novel about police violence. It's a novel about family legacies. It's a novel about authors on book tour. It's a novel about capitalism and consumerism. It's kind of pitched as a fever dream of American pop culture. We've had some great events this semester. We began with an event early in the semester about literary marketing. We had the founders of Gold Leaf Literary, which is a literary marketing firm here in Asheville, come and talk to us about book tours, positioning a book to go out into the marketplace. And then last month we had Dr. Megan Underhill talk about how families, both white and black families, condition their children to navigate the world around the systemic power levers of racial dynamics in America, which was a fascinating topic. Next semester, our text is going to be The Other Dr. Gilmer, Two Men, a Murder, and an Unlikely Fight for Justice. This is a local book. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer is a physician who practices here in Asheville. This is based on the murder when a doctor out in Fletcher named Vince Gilmer murdered his father many, many years ago. You're shaking your head as if you remember it. So Vince Gilmer practiced at a clinic, and then after he went to prison for his father's murder, Benjamin Gilmer, who coincidentally shared the last name of the doctor he was replacing, came in and learned the history of Vince Gilmer, who is highly thought of by his patients and beloved in the community. And he learned about the murder and kind of the tragedy that unfolded. And it set him on a journey of investigating not only that murder and Vince Gilmer's conviction, but also the ways in which mental health is treated in the American justice system. And so I'm really excited about next semester. We're going to have an event with Benjamin Gilmer at the end of the semester. We're going to have an event with the investigating officer, as well as the reporters who covered the crime locally. We'll have an event about neuroscience and public policy in terms of criminal justice. And so I'm really, really excited about that, and I hope you can all join us. You can get this book at Malaprops or that obscure website named after a river online that doesn't pay local or state taxes. That's where you choose to do your shopping. I thought tonight, while we are waiting on our speaker, I would talk a little bit about Hell of a Book for those of you who have not read it, and there is not an expectation to have read it to come to these events. Lily and Miriam are two of my students. They've both read the book and committed it to memory, as all good students at UNC do. Thank you for the vote of acknowledgement, Lily. But this is, I'm teaching this book this semester in a class on North Carolina literature. And I'm teaching literature based on real events in the state's history. And we started with contemporary events and we moved back in time. So we're coming up on the end of the semester and we are about to finish our experience reading The Road by John Ely, which is about the building of the Swannanoa Gap tunnel system just off I-40 down around Old Fort, in between Old Fort and Asheville. And if you've been paying attention to some of the work that Dan Pierce is doing over in the history department, you may know that that railroad was built primarily with black convict labor in the late 19th century, and that the bodies of many of those men are buried alongside the track. As many as 300 bodies could be buried alongside the track of the Swannanoa Tunnel. The first book we began with is Hell of a Book, and Jason Mott, who lives down in Bolton, North Carolina, got the idea for the book in a number of ways. As writers, books come to you in ideas. I was speaking to a class on campus today, and I was trying to explain to them how, as a writer, you live in the real world, so you've got an ear turned toward things like my taxes are due April 15th, but you've also got an ear turned toward, what did that person across the room say? You know, and you're always engaging with the world in a very insular way that feels kind of internally expansive. And that's certainly what Jason does. But he got the idea originally for Hell of a Book, or at least the seed was planted after the mayor of Bolton, a man named Sidney Bowen, when Jason was a child growing up in Bolton, North Carolina, which is a primary black community. Sidney Bowen was Bolton's first black mayor, and he was shot by a police officer and killed after a traffic stop in front of his house. And so this is an incident from a very young age that just lodged itself in Jason's mind. And then, you know, he grows up and becomes this successful author, and he goes on book tour, and obviously the novel folds that experience in. But the summer of 2020, the racial reckoning that we all faced after George Floyd's murder, all of that came to bear on Jason's experience writing this book. But he couldn't escape the way he felt as a young black child in Bolton, knowing that the first black mayor of his town was murdered in front of his house. And I thought I would read maybe the first 75 pages of the book to give you an idea of what it sounds like. We'll take a break, let Blue speak for a little bit. I'll come back. We lock the doors. There's water, there's a bathroom. I'll finish now. I would read a scene, I might read a scene very quickly from the book to give you an idea of what a confrontation, of how a confrontation like this might play out. And in this scene, one of the main characters is a young boy named Soot. That's his nickname because of what is explained as his impossibly dark skin. And this is the story of Soot's father, who was out for a jog at night in his own neighborhood. And then I want to tell you a story that happened in Greensboro and tie in kind of how my class talked about this book. So Soot's father, William, down in Bolton, North Carolina, eastern North Carolina, is out for a jog one night. The way back home was more of the same splendor. He passed the dwindling moments of other parties. By now, people were too tired or drunk or just having too much fun to see him jogging past them in the night. It was when he was reaching his home that he saw the glimmer of the blue lights behind him. The siren chirped, and William moved to the side of the road and looked back over his shoulder. Blue lights hovered. Headlights blinded him. He turned back and saw his home. The little square of wood and nails and memories destined to come to an end. He could throw a stone and hit it if he wanted, or he could run to it and be there inside seconds. The police car came to a stop behind him. He heard a door open. "Hold on right there," a heavy voice called out. William took a deep breath and turned. All he saw was the glare of headlights and the flash of blue. A silhouette climbed out of the car and said, "Just wait right there." A flashlight shined in his eyes, and reflexively, he lifted a hand to shield his eyes from the light. "Don't do that," the silhouette said. William felt a shiver run down his spine. He lowered his hand slowly. "What are you doing out here?" the silhouette said. "Running home." "Why are you running in the dark?" "Gets too hot in the daytime, that's all." William turned. His lungs trembled in his chest, and he felt as though he were drowning. His arms still worked, but they did not know what to do with themselves. "Calm down," he said to himself. "Calm down. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay." Those were the words he wanted to say, but all that came out was a pain-filled moan. The shape that shot behind him shouted something, but William couldn't hear the words. He needed to get home. If he could get home, everything would be okay. His wife would be there, and his son would be there, and together, they would all be okay. they would be safe. If only he could make it home. So, when you think about an encounter like that with the police, we know that since Father William does not survive that encounter with the police, I want to direct you toward an encounter, not a dissimilar encounter that a man named Marcus Smith had with police in Greensboro, North Carolina in 2018 after a festival in downtown Greensboro. Marcus Smith was a man who was very well known in the community. He was sometimes unhoused, but he was very well thought of, and he was experiencing a mental health episode when he was encountered by the police. And they ended up being what's known as hog-tied by the police, and he died as a result of his being tied in that way. His breathing was limited, not unlike George Floyd, but just a slightly different circumstance. And then comes the information, and I'm going to tie it back to Hell of a Book, and I'm going to introduce Blue, who's coming in hot from New Orleans. You got the beads on? But when I taught Hell of a Book, I taught it as a piece of modernist literature, where we have these various stories coming to coalesce around a narrative that feels very unstable, right? And right now in America, I feel like our narrative is very unstable. There is a true narrative and there is the destabilization of narrative. Well, Marcus Smith's narrative was muddled from the very beginning. His parents didn't realize that he was dead when he arrived at the hospital because the information that had come out from the police and then the city was incorrect and led in many, many different directions. And so with an experience like Marcus Smith's murder, we have all of these different narratives coming to bear. And that's what happens in Hell of a Book. We have these various narratives titrated down to a single experience, which I find incredibly interesting in terms of the novels, what the novel's doing in terms of its literary heft. But now I want to introduce tonight's speaker. Blue Buchanan is both a qualitative and historical scholar, employing methods ranging from archival analysis to oral history and interviews. Their research focuses broadly on the role of violence in everyday life, which informs their twin research trajectories. Number one, studying whiteness and masculinity as projects shaping intracommunal violence in the LGBT community. And two, the practices and habits of black trans folk developed to resist and decenter violence in their everyday lives. Friends, it's a privilege and a joy to welcome Blue Buchanan.
Okay, well, I'll get myself set up here. I do want to sort of put out before I get going that I am going to actually be switching up my presentation just slightly. And one of the reasons for this is because as I was working on my slides and as I was traveling across the South the past few days, I realized that one of the dangers of a presentation like this, looking at police violence, is reinstating that violence, right, through a sort of hyper-focus only on the way that particularly black folks die. So one of the things today that I'm going to be trying to do is talk about a little bit of a different perspective, one that really features things like the pleasures of white supremacy. And that might seem a little bit weird, right? We tend to sort of, got double verification up in here. Yeah. The goal of this is to identify not simply the pain and the violence of police shootings, but the fundamental conditions under which they occur. okay? So we're gonna be looking at nationalism. Yes, I am the person. Apologies, tech things, doing tech things. While I'm getting this set up, the second part of what I'm going to be doing is moving us past talking about data visualization, talking about sharing this narrative, and moving us towards the practical aspects, right? So we're going to do this in two parts. One, we're going to talk about how white supremacy is fundamental to the United States as a nation state, okay? The second part is going to be, what do we do about it? And I really want to stress that second aspect, because one of the things that can happen when we sit in a room like this one is that everyone's like clapping each other on the back and like, yes, look at us, we attended a talk. I have to verify it's me again? Okay.
It's because they've been to New Orleans, they're like,
you know what, that is what it is.
Like something changed.
So I want here to really, again, focus on the practical, on the material. I was going to introduce with some music. We're a little bit over time, so I'm going to move past this. But I do want to sort of harken back to, you should have access to these slides online if you go back to the stream. So I encourage you to listen to this video as a way of getting drawn into talking about anti-Blackness and the nation state. Okay. So here, I want to start with my talk's title, Sediments of Transit, America's Foundations in Anti-Blackness. Here, I've drawn on an image from the book, in which Soot, one of our main characters, talks about a world that he dreams of that is in the sky, right? He says it's a world where everything is black. It's black like me, right? And so this is the world that we are going to be seeing in the distance and seen as a reflection of the world we currently are living in. And again, I'm going to move us relatively quickly. These were slides I made when I was focused on black pain. We're going to, again, try to shift the conversation a little bit. But I want to start first with one of the quotes that William says to his son. He says, "This boy is only the first of many that you will meet over your life. They will stack upon one another week by week. You'll try to keep them in your head, but eventually you'll become too full, and they'll spill out and be left behind." These are the sediments that I'm hoping to evoke as part of this conversation. Those who are left behind, the spilled out. And understand that this spilling out is also an offering to white supremacy and its pleasures. I ask and challenge you to think about how many people you can name, right? And even myself, sometimes I am embarrassed that I can't remember the folks that I said I would not forget just a few years ago. In contrast to this focus on remembering, one of the things that white supremacy does is it encourages a particular kind of structured forgetting. And here I'm bringing in sort of a sociological lens to really talk about how white supremacy in particular encourages forgetting. And so one of the things that we tend to do is think about ignorance as if it just happens, right? Oh no, you just weren't educated about a particular topic. But that doesn't necessarily fit with what folks like Rory McVeigh, who studies the KKK, talks about as structured ignorance. There are systems in place that allow the United States to forget. And I say the United States in particular because of its deep linkages, right? The roots of the United States in white supremacy. Here, something that I often share with my class is I believe it's the third stanza of the national anthem. And here it says that no refuge could save the hireling and the slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Quite literally within our national anthem, both class and race are being represented, right? The roots of the United States are in structures of forgetting. In talking about how the United States is structured and laid out, we get this in our text as well. The author says, I still can't believe this kid's mother, an old man, never took the time to lay out the roadmap of the world for him. What is the world in which he's supposed to navigate? Let's see if no? Yeah, I can do the things. Okay. So when we're talking about structures of ignorance, we're talking about travel and transit. This is a short video that moves us first from our unnamed city in the Midwest. Here I chose Kansas City, not because I'm trying to judge anyone, but it was centrally located, to Bolton, to Whitesville, down to two of our locations in Florida. Here we've got Miami and Orlando. And part of what's happening during this novel is laying out routes of transit, of travel itself. And here I want to connect this transit, who is allowed to move freely and who is not, to the consequences of citizenship itself. Who counts as a citizen and who doesn't. One of the reasons why I specifically tried to move away from the language of Black pain in our discussion is because of experiences even on the road, as my travel companions can note, being stopped by Mississippi police officers and having both the experiences in the book, as well as Sandra Bland, as well as all of these other names of people stopped in routine circumstances. These are all instances that are flashing through my mind as we are in that moment. Who is allowed to travel freely? In fact, this question of who is allowed to travel freely, who counts as an individual and as a citizen, is reflected in the language of the author, right? I see the exact same faces that I saw on the other coast. This isn't a product necessarily of actual people being the same, but of their structural position being the same and calling forth similar social movement strategies and tactics. In doing so, our author is also building out connections that say there is not that much difference between the places where this violence happens and, say, good, liberal, progressive places of community making. Like, say, UNCA or Asheville. Much of my presentation here, and again, I'm going to move us relatively quickly through this is about the layering of processes of anti-Blackness. So thinking about geography, about our map, and about its consequences. I'm again just going to lay out that these are some resources and encourage you to take a look at them on your own time. Again, so that we can focus more on the workshop question. But here, what I want to sort of note is that Black folks brought to the United States are displaced indigenous peoples. This is sometimes sort of missing from our broader conversation. And that displacement occurs through processes of genocide and settler colonialism. Thus, the struggle of Native and Indigenous people more broadly here in North America is deeply tied to the processes of anti-Blackness itself. These twin processes constitute the United States as we know and experience it today. If you're interested in learning more about Native tribal lands that maybe you lived, grew up on, profited from in some way, I encourage you to take a look at the nativeland.ca website. It provides a ton of different resources on indigeneity and on this sort of historical process by which the nation state was constructed. As indigenous folks are displaced, destroyed, erased, or otherwise relegated to some timeless historical past, we see the instantiation of practices of buying and selling slaves. And in fact, this sort of mindset is captured, I think, really powerfully by our author when they talk about Black folks in the United States, a whole nation, unwanted and unsought, born into exile in the belly of another nation. It should be noted here, right, that unwanted and unsought is not necessarily the case, but utilized, commodified, right? That it's not a whole nation of people, but a set of resources that are displaced, brought over, and extracted, right? Here we've got another of our interactive maps looking at this process of bringing enslaved folks, both to North and South America, right? This question of indigeneity, this question of nation states, is certainly not limited to the United States. Processes like the transatlantic slave trade are historical. I feel like we shouldn't have to debate their existence, but it is important to recognize, particularly in an era of quote-unquote anti-CRT, that this history is incredibly important. We saw folks like Donald Trump creating sort of counter committees to narrate his own nationalist vision. He says, we're too broken up by this process, by the recognition that violence has happened. We need to return back to unity, right? To a sense of national pride. In fact, the commission that he initiates is called the 1776 committee, and they do produce a pretty powerful piece of propaganda that you can still find online to this day. The movement of Black folks is not simply coerced. There's obviously resistant forms of organizing and transit itself shaping where Black people end up. Folks moving south to places like Mexico, I feel like oftentimes we don't realize like Mexico has a large Black community. This was also a part of the Underground Railroad, as well as communities in Canada as well. If we're going to take into account indigeneity and anti-Blackness together and talk about the sediments of their transit, we also have to talk about the Trail of Tears. Something that is often overlooked is that much of our sort of quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes were so-called because they owned slaves. The movement of Black people, for example, to places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? The creation of Black Wall Street there is by and large a relationship to these tribes being forced out from places quite nearby into the Midwest. Again, quite literally, the consequences of nation-state building in the United States is simultaneously a process of exclusion and of control. Now, folks like Dana Nelson, a sociologist and historian, have talked about how early sort of colonial understandings of Americanness were incredibly, incredibly fragile. And part of what Nelson argues is that these processes of violence, these processes of displacement, are what established what they term an imagined fraternity of whiteness. That this is the thing that brought together your different colonial governments, different areas that had wildly different languages, right? Wildly different cultural practices together as American. What constituted being American is in of itself a product of violence, right? And I really want to stress this because today we often see folks say, well, you know, there's bad patriotism, right? There's bad sort of nationalism, and then there's patriotism. And one is good and the other is bad. But if we actually look at the sort of sociological and historical record, the differences between those two are remarkably minuscule, right? What is patriotic is part of what is anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. For folks who don't know what the Red Record is, this is another sort of mapping project that emerges, this particular term emerges from Ida B. Wells. And the Red Record specifically refers to Wells's work on lynching. And I really want to claim Ida B. Wells as a sociologist because she is so often left out of the canon. However, her work is sociological. She's one of the first to give us tabulated statistics on lynching. And this was incredibly important because before then, folks simply talked about lynching as if it was spontaneous, as if it was mysterious and an erratic phenomenon that just happened. But Wells really demonstrates that there are patterns of behavior that accompany lynchings. And so it talks about this, right, when discussing their grandfather, visiting him in Whiteville, right, a sleepy small southern town in a sleepy small southern county with a long history of strawberry production and lynchings. Now, here's where I want to get us back into this discussion of pleasure. Because one of the things that is often misunderstood about lynchings is their public and entertainment value. If you look at the historical record, for example, people would share postcards of the lynchings that they attended. They'd send them off like Christmas cards to the rest of their families and friends, right? This is, in of itself, a way of building connections between white people through the shared pleasure of commodifying, right, and violating Black bodies and subjectivity. Here there's another great and interactive report. In fact, Buncombe County is listed here as having at least 3 documented lynchings. And I should note that while this image focuses in on the South, lynching was certainly not limited to southern states. In fact, if you look to the west, things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, other forms of legislation led to mass lynchings across the West Coast and the Southwest. Here, theorists talk about the relationship between things like nationalism and fascism and white supremacy, talk about how the United States doesn't necessarily have to have fascism in the way that we see it in other places, because it has always had what some scholars term an incipient fascism, or as Langston Hughes terms it, our native fascisms. An adherence to statism, love of the government, when it's the government that's doing what we want it to do, right? And one of the key things about fascism is that you don't simply have state violence, that you have extra state violence. And that is both the relationship between lynching, right, and state forms, state-sanctioned forms of violence like police killings. I had so many more slides than I do time. Here we've got the Great Migration. I should note that the Great Migration is facilitated by those lynchings. In particular, one of the things that the Red Record demonstrates is actually a bunch of Black vets from World War I return home from Europe and are confronted by the fact that they have fought a world war to come back to this place that ostensibly is about freedom. And this actually leads to the Red Summer of 1917. Mass lynchings across the South and across the Southwest, specifically focused on Black vets, right? Black folks who had served in the military, who were now too uppity, right? Who had now decided that they had too many rights in comparison to what they were expected to have in the United States. This leads to the Great Migration, the mass exodus of large numbers of Black folks, just for those who might have missed it. Movements from the South into the North, in large part fleeing these mass sources of lynching. I should note, though, that this process is actually reversed. We're seeing folks leaving northern cities for the South because those lynchings didn't stop when people went north. They simply found new processes, new ways to manifest themselves, particularly in things like state-sanctioned police violence. In addition, here I was like, I'm not going to do Black pain, but like here I am. I got lots of maps on Black pain. In addition to processes like lynchings, you had sundown towns as well. Places where you would not stop, could not stop, lest you be confronted by the potential for lynchings or imprisonment. Sundown towns quite literally refer to places where non-white people should not be after sundown. Real straightforward. In response to things like extra state killings, Black people are still on the move, right? Still trying to both escape experiences of anti-Black violence, moving to places like the North and the West, right? In the beginning of our book, we heard William, the dad, be like, I'm gonna go find another kid out in the West, right? How do you get there became a central problem. And this is where we have things like the Green Book. The Green Book, some of y'all may know from some of the mass media that's come out lately, but really it's a travel guide that lists where it is safe to do things like get gas, stay in a hotel, right? Where can you get food? Where would you be welcome as a Black traveler? Again, this process of nation building is about access and control to movement. Where are people allowed to go? Up through the 1960s, Oregon, for example, had state laws exiling and making sure that Black people could not move there, right? So when we wonder, like, why is Portland so hella white? Well, that is one of the reasons, right? This is a process of controlling things like migration. And it's not just simply at the large scale level, we're also talking about communities being redlined at the material level as well. And here is a quote that I think brings together everything from our sundown towns to our redlined communities to talking about police violence. The author, who is with Soot, right, with our invisible kid at the Hershey's factory in Pennsylvania. He says, so my stomach does all that it can in response to the dread, the fear that is talking about this systemic anti-Blackness across the nation state. He says, my stomach does all it can. It vomits up all the chocolate, all the Twizzlers, all the lynched dreams, the red-lined hopes, the colorblind promises that got stop and frisked. It all comes erupting out of me faster than the red glare of those famous rockets bursting in air, right? Again, tying back to this idea of Americana. Here we've got a lovely picture of New York, red line. Again, this is an interactive map that includes places like Asheville. You can find the Homeowners Loan Corporation map for this region on this map, and I encourage you to check it out. There are some maps, and actually this is an interesting one, there's some maps that refuse to be made, right, or that continue to be obscured. For example, only recently, I believe this is a 2021 article, have they begun building a compendium of U.S. jails to understand exactly how far and how wide prison is a shaping factor in U.S. life. Now, again, we're turning to this conversation in which the nation state is a source of pleasure, a place of belonging, right? You've got Soot, you've got your author, you've got this sense of displacement around anti-Blackness. Well, if anti-Blackness is this process of displacement, whiteness in many ways is its opposite. It's a sense of belonging. It's a sense of freedom to move within and around any obstacles, any region that you should want to, right? Unbounded promise. And the cop reiterates this in the novel, right? He says, you're ungrateful. This country is the greatest place on this whole planet. And I won't say it ain't had its troubles, but when you compare those troubles against the rest of the world, against the way things are done, happen in other parts of the world, even the worst person in this country has it pretty damn good. Again, ignoring the fact that settler colonialism that created the conditions that have unsettled those other places that our COP is condemning is simultaneously creating the Black, Native, Indigenous body that becomes cops, the cop, and cops more generally, victim. Here, too many things. Here, thanks to a colleague and comrade, Ellie White, we can see how military weaponry and equipment builds up in its own sediments over time. This map charts what is termed the 1033 program. That is a program that funnels U.S. military surplus goods to local police departments at only the cost of shipping. This is one of the reasons why places like Ferguson, places like Davis, California, places like West Lafayette in Indiana have things like mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. The very process of reinforcing the nation-state's borders are also turned inward. And this is in millions of dollars, by the way. Just a small thing. It is incredibly difficult to get like $5,000 of grant money from like a external force, but you can put in like a 5-sentence request for a mine-resistant armored vehicle, and as long as you say like, Jack is definitely down to drive it if we need to. If they've got it, they can ship it to you. This domestic warfare itself presents Black folks out of place as dangerous, as permanent exiles, and not simply that, but as terrorists. One of the reasons why I think that it's incredibly important for us to talk about things like police violence, and actually this is sort of one of the questions that our COP gives us, is how threat is understood from within the nation state. Who is a threat to the nation state, and what is the COP's role in that process? Again, here our COP says, well, this man's got a family, right? He's a good man, and you're threatening his family. You always were a threat to his family, and thus you were justified, or he was justified, in the actions that he took. We've already had a little bit of a reading of this section. But as we come to the end, and if you are interested in a map of this, we've got one here. There's an entire interactive process that you can check out on mappingpoliceviolence.org, another interactive source of information. What I want to lay out is that as Black folks are moving through the spaces that constitute the United States, as folks are aware of these processes, myself included, as I'm driving on the highway, I know that town has had lynchings. I know that that town was a sundown town. I know that that town has mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles. I know that town has gotten rifles from the military. And so part of what we're talking about with this process of nation-state building, of the outlines of the United States, are outlines of violence. Who has the ability and who has the right to commit violence on others, to have that violence legitimized? And what I would like to challenge folks, I'm already at 8 o'clock. What I want to challenge folks to do is to think about how processes like transformative justice take away the ability, both for the state and for whiteness, to create violence under the terminology of innocence. Right? It doesn't matter if Trayvon had Skittles or not. It doesn't matter if Michael Brown got something from a gas station. It doesn't matter if George Floyd had a 20 that was counterfeit or not. That is beside the point, right? These exercises are not exercises in evaluating the innocence or criminality of a particular people. They are preemptive. They are pleasureful. They are used to, again, reestablish a sense of common fraternity around things like whiteness and the nation state. My workshop part, which I was going to get to, was going to challenge y'all to engage in that question of transformative justice in particular. So transformative justice is a model specifically founded in women of color feminist traditions. And I should note, this book was not great about women, really at all, right? So the reason why I want to sort of put that out there is that there may be a reason why our author doesn't give us a route towards handling this process of violence. And that's because they are not drawing from that tradition, right? And that's not to cast judgment, but simply to say this would be an opening, right? For us to engage collectively in the kind of care work that it takes to actually confront these kinds of violence, right? It's not simply enough to disavow, as we see, right, with the author. It's not enough to simply be unseen, right? But it is about seeing each other and being willing to take the necessary steps materially and structurally to care for one another in ways that actually demonstrate, right, our shared and collective dignity. Not simply in ways that sort of give us a nod towards, like, yeah, we're the same, but rather, as folks like Audre Lorde talk about, organizing through difference. We are in different social positions. We're in different social locations. How can we use those different social locations rather than getting caught up in shame, which can be a very overwhelming emotion when seeing this much violence, right? How do we avoid getting into shame and instead highlight where we can actually intervene? Right? I have a coda on travel, on talking about finding that place, right? What does it look like to find that place together? And not just that, one of the things that I also was thinking through as I was reading the book was its connection to Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. And Ellison themselves, in their introduction, interestingly, talks about sociology. No, not in, he doesn't love it, doesn't love sociology. That's fair. That he says, really, this idea of high visibility itself is not helpful, right? Because it's not simply about high visibility. It is about structural forms of violence. The visibility comes after, right? Another part from him says, right, despite the bland assertions of sociologists, high visibility actually renders these processes invisible. Whether at high noon in Macy's window or illuminated by flaming torches and flash bulbs while undergoing the ritual sacrifice that was dedicated to the ideal of white supremacy. Again, we see the language of invisibility and hypervisibility troubled in that it's not simply about seeing the person, right? But about doing the organizing work necessary. Doing things like, say, going to your neighbor and being like, hey, there's other ways to provide support other than calling the police. Which I was going to encourage y'all to like have a conversation amongst yourselves as to what that looks like, because they do exist. And there's lots of things out there in Asheville, right? Beloved is an organization here in Asheville that's doing lots of that kind of work, right? Don't let structural ignorance keep you doing the same old things, right? Structural ignorance has to be combated not just with education, but with actual commitments and practices. And something I want to leave y'all with, a challenge perhaps, is to pick one area, one particular place in the Asheville community where you take up a practice of support, amplification, intervention. Something that goes beyond an intellectual exercise in which like, oh yes, like now we know that there are sundown towns, awesome, to really asking like, what does it mean to distance ourselves or to untether ourselves from the affective pleasures of white supremacy? And I guess I'm already up on time, but we also see this in the book, right? Tyrone makes fun of soot. When I'm talking about the affective pleasures of white supremacy, I'm not necessarily talking about white bodies, but about the structure which places whiteness sort of at its heart. Right? So with that, I appreciate folks bearing with me, and I also want to end by saying that I am incredibly grateful and appreciative for folks' patience with my 10-hour plus drive from New Orleans today in order to share this talk with you. Thank you.
Can you take a couple of questions?
Yes, I would love questions. Give me questions. Thoughts? Yes.
You have created a kind of community guide for talking with your neighbors, giving options that aren't calling the police. Is there a place where that's available to the wider community?
Yes. But only on like Queer Asheville Exchange. So, and also like on a zine content creator page. I would be happy to provide Wiley with the link to that to make it public and accessible. Absolutely. So for those who haven't been in my classes before, one of the things that happened, an unhoused gentleman was walking around our neighborhood, which is the Burton Street community, no pants on, seemed like he was having a tough day. And some parents across the way were concerned, but again, didn't know any resource, like what are you supposed to do in that moment, right? And that prompted me to reach out to a number of sources to create basically a Burton Street Care Not Cops guide to provide just information and resources.
Yes, please share that.
Yeah.
Can you also, Blue, if you would, you mentioned Audre Lorde, and I totally agree with you about the absence of female voices in this novel and representation. Can you, off the top of your head, and I don't want to put you on the spot, some female voices, whether in sociology or literature or the cultural space, that you would repair to in moments like this, as not as a corresponding read to Hell of a Book necessarily, but I feel like, I mean, this is off the cuff, but from labor to politics, it's always been women of color or women of a certain class on the edge leading, right? In my opinion. So could you share some resources that come to mind?
Ooh, yes, I can. So one, there's a group called Insight. They have an anthology called The Color of Violence, right? That looks specifically at how to confront violence in our communities when we don't want to use police, right? This specifically was a response from a number of women of color who saw the early 90s sort of response of white feminists to simply criminalize things like domestic abuse and violence as just another way of harming communities of color. And especially, I should note that, interestingly enough, or perhaps not, I study really messed up things, so sometimes I'm like, oh, interesting, but is that oftentimes it's the women who are calling the police to protect them from abusive, say, partners, who are then the subject of the police violence, right, or incarceration. In fact, Black women are the #1 growing demographic of folks being imprisoned in the United States, right? So when we're talking about this, I think Insight is a great organization. Andrea Ritchie, some other folks have worked on, for example, there's a volume that just came out called No More Police that is incredibly powerful. I'm trying to think, I'm like, I've got it all in my like online library. What's that one? Oh yeah, Miriam Kava. We Do This Till We Free Us, right? Is a great volume that again is like a really introductory level abolitionist text. Who else? I'm like drawing on the partner network.
Literature, like maybe Jefferson.
Adrienne Marie Brown.
Yeah, Adrienne Marie Brown. Controversial, but like can be helpful, absolutely. Again, there are also lots of examples of folks like there's a group of Black mothers in Southside Chicago that have introduced like transformative justice processes to avoid involving police and prisons, right? So I would be happy to also send along links to any and all of those things as well. Any last questions? We're good. We're like, yes, the United States is composed of anti-Black violence. Let's destroy that a little bit. Yeah. How was my day? It was not great. I woke up, so like, this was my first time driving through the South, other than going down to New Orleans. There's like, Mississippi just has cops on like every like 500 feet. And that just, it was a lot. I had a nice anxiety attack. Had to stop, do the touch, smell, see things, and then get back in the car. So I would say, yeah, I'm tired, but I'm also invigorated by the community building that's happening, or that I hope is happening. Thank you. Me too. Shoot. I see Wiley's hovering with some books.
Got 4 copies if anybody wants a copy. Fill the book. You can see me on the way out. And Dr. Blue Buchanan.
Yeah, thank you.